I'm Edward, and I always feel happy to be here with you. If you're a lover of cozy mysteries, these tales are waiting for you on Spotify. Just follow the link in the description. Now settle back and listen. Chapter 1. A Murmur in the Drawing Room. There are households in every English village which serve as a kind of moral landmark. Establishments whose good order reassures those who pass their gates each morning, whose curtains are always drawn to precisely the right degree, and whose inhabitants conduct themselves with a composure so consistent it might almost be mistaken for contentment. In St Mary Mead, that household was Ashcombe House. Ashcombe House stood at the quieter end of the village, set back from the lane by a well-maintained gravel path, and shielded from the road by a row of copper beech trees that had been planted, so it was said, by Mrs. Eleanor Carrington's mother-in-law some 40 years before. The house itself was handsome without being showy. A broad red brick Edwardian property with tall sash windows and a porch framed by climbing roses, which in late June were in their fullest and most fragrant bloom. It was the sort of house that invited admiration rather than curiosity, and had, for a great many years, received precisely that. Mrs. Eleanor Carrington had been its mistress for nearly 2 decades. She was a woman of perhaps 55, slender and upright in the way of those who have given consistent attention to posture since girlhood. Her hair, which had once been a deep chestnut, was now a handsome silver worn in smooth, close waves. Her manner was invariably pleasant, her opinions invariably measured, and her hospitality invariably adequate without being extravagant. She dressed well, but not fashionably, attended church each Sunday without ostentation, and contributed reliably to every local cause that might reasonably require her support. In short, she was exactly what the village expected her to be, and the village was grateful for it. It was therefore a matter of some consequence when, on a warm Tuesday morning in the last week of June 1958, a quiet murmur began to find its way from one drawing room to the next. The murmur concerned a maid. Her name was Elsie Turner, and she had been employed at Ashcombe House for a little under 8 months. She was a young woman of 22 or 23, with a plain, open face and the kind of conscientious manner that landladies describe as reliable, and employers describe as satisfactory. She had come to the position with a reasonable character reference from a family in the next village, had settled without difficulty into the routines of the household, and had given, by all accounts, no particular cause for concern, and then, without warning or adequate explanation, she had gone. The manner of her going was what attracted attention. There had been no raised voices, no tearful scene observed through the kitchen window, no angry departure with bags hastily packed and a taxi summoned from the village. The household had simply continued its morning as usual, and when the time came for Elsie's duties to begin, she was no longer there. Her room had been left tidy. Her personal belongings had been removed with quiet efficiency, and on the back staircase folded with a neatness that spoke of deliberation rather than distress, her uniform had been left behind. Mrs. Carrington, when asked, said only that the girl had proven unsuitable. She offered nothing further, and her tone, though composed as it always was, carried within it a finality that discouraged further inquiry. Those who knew her well enough to look for it might have observed a slight additional stillness about her eyes, a careful management of expression that went a fraction beyond her customary reserve. But Mrs. Carrington was not a woman given to visible emotion, and most people took her explanation at face value and thought no more of it. Most people, that is, or excepting those for whom other people's arrangements formed a natural subject of study. Miss Jane Marple had lived in St Mary Mead for the greater part of her life. She occupied a pleasant cottage not far from the church, tended a garden of which she was quietly proud, and occupied herself with the kind of steady, unassuming observation of village affairs that those who did not know her might mistake for idle curiosity. She was a slight elderly woman with white hair, pale blue eyes of considerable sharpness, and a manner so gentle and unhurried that it tended to disarm even those who might otherwise have been more guarded. She was, as her old friends knew, one of the most perceptive people in the county, though she would never have said so herself, and would have looked faintly distressed if anyone else had said so within her hearing. She first heard of the matter on a Wednesday morning, when her old friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry called in for coffee and a review of village affairs. Dolly Bantry was a stout, warm-hearted woman with a fondness for roses, dogs, and the kind of social intelligence that expresses itself chiefly in noticing who has stopped speaking to whom. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with an air of restrained but unmistakable interest, accepted her coffee, settled herself in the garden chair, and said that she had heard the most peculiar thing about Ashcombe House. Miss Marple, who was engaged in a small piece of knitting, looked up with mild attention. Mrs. Bantry recounted what she knew, which was not, in point of fact, a great deal. The maid had left. The manner of the leaving was odd. Mrs. Carrington was not saying much. And what she did say was not altogether satisfying. There was a feeling, Dolly paused here, searching for the right word, that something had been seen or heard or understood that could not be freely spoken of. It is an unpleasantly delicate situation, she concluded, with the air of someone who has expressed things precisely as she intended. Miss Marple set down her knitting for a moment. "Delicacy, my dear," she said softly, "often conceals far more than it reveals." Mrs. Bantry agreed that this was probably true, and said she thought the whole thing might amount to nothing at all. Perhaps the girl had simply found a better position elsewhere, and had been too awkward to say so plainly. Perhaps Mrs. Carrington had found fault with her work and preferred to dispose of the matter quietly. These things happened in households all the time, and it was quite possible that the whispers would come to nothing and be replaced within a fortnight by some other piece of village interest. Miss Marple said that this was quite possible, but she did not, Dolly noticed, return immediately to her knitting. Instead, she sat for a moment with her hands resting lightly on the wool and gazed out at her garden with an expression that was thoughtful and faintly attentive, as though a small thing had been set in motion in the back of her mind and had not yet found its resting place. The afternoon was warm, and the roses along the garden wall were showing very well. A pair of wood pigeons made their unhurried sound somewhere in the copper beech at the corner of the lane. From the direction of the village shop came the occasional pleasant ring of the bell above the door. St. Mary Mead continued about its business in the composed and orderly fashion that had always been its nature. There was nothing, on the surface of things, to suggest that anything had gone amiss within its pleasant boundaries. The copper beeches at Ashcombe House stood as green and undisturbed as ever. Its curtains were drawn to exactly the right degree. And yet, a young woman had left a folded uniform on a back staircase and walked away in silence. She had offered no public complaint. She had made no formal accusation. She had only gone, with a neatness and quietness that suggested she understood rather more than anyone had given her credit for. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. She thought of households she'd known, and of the things that were managed within them rather than spoken of, and of the curious way in which silence, when it was the silence of deliberate choice rather than ignorance, could carry as much meaning as any direct statement. The pigeons continued their conversation in the copper beech. The afternoon settled warmly over the village, and in the cottages and parlours of St. Mary Mead, the murmur continued its quiet passage from one drawing-room to the next, gathering as it went, as murmurs always do, a shape and a weight that its origin alone could not entirely explain. Chapter 2. A uniform left on the back stair. By Thursday, the murmur had acquired a degree of firmness that mere repetition tends to confer upon even the most uncertain of reports. It had passed through the post office, settled briefly at the counter of the village shop, and been carried, with various small additions and subtractions, into half a dozen households, whose inhabitants would each have said, with perfect sincerity, that they were not the sort of people who paid attention to gossip. Miss Marple, who understood the mechanics of village rumour as well as any person alive, observed its progress with the quiet attention of a naturalist, watching the habits of a familiar but still instructive species. She did not contribute to it, she did not need to. She had long since discovered that the most useful position in relation to a circulating story was not at its centre nor at its edges, but somewhere just to one side, still enough to hear everything, unobtrusive enough to be overlooked. On Thursday afternoon she called upon Mrs. Eleanor Carrington. The visit was arranged with perfect propriety. Miss Marple had offered, some weeks previously, to bring cuttings from a particularly successful strain of white climbing rose that had established itself most agreeably along the south wall of her cottage garden. Mrs. Carrington had expressed polite interest. The cuttings were now ready. There was, therefore, every reason to call, and no reason at all for Mrs. Carrington to feel that the call was anything other than what it appeared to be. Ashcombe House received her in its customary manner. The gravel path was raked smooth, the roses at the porch were generous and fragrant, and the young woman who answered the door, a girl of perhaps 17, with the slightly startled expression of one newly placed in service, showed her into the drawing-room with careful but not entirely confident formality. She was not Elsie Turner. That much was immediately apparent. She had none of the settled ease that 8 months in a well-run household tends to produce. She was, Miss Marple thought, a temporary arrangement. Mrs. Carrington appeared within a few minutes, composed and welcoming in the manner of one who has been expecting the visit, and has decided how it shall proceed. She was dressed in a soft grey wool, appropriate to the indoor chill that even a warm June day could not quite banish from rooms of a certain size, and she wore at her throat a single strand of pearls which were, Miss Marple noted, exactly the right pearls for the occasion. Nothing about her suggested discomposure, yet she greeted her visitor with a warmth that was perhaps half a degree more emphatic than usual. The warmth, Miss Marple reflected, of a person who wished to establish at once that all was well. They sat. Tea was brought, managed by the new girl with a concentration that would have been endearing under other circumstances. The rose cuttings were discussed and admired. Mrs. Carrington spoke knowledgeably about soil conditions and the importance of aspect. She had gardened all her life, she said, and had found it one of the most reliable of pleasures. It was Miss Marple who introduced the subject of the household, and she did so with a gentle indirection that was entirely natural to her character. She remarked that the young girl who had shown her in seemed very new to her duties. Mrs. Carrington agreed, without any particular change in expression, that she was making certain temporary arrangements. Her regular maid had recently left the position. Miss Marple said, with the mild sympathy of one accustomed to such domestic difficulties, that it was always an inconvenience when a servant proved unsuitable. Mrs. Carrington said yes, it was. She'd found Elsie Turner a pleasant enough girl in many respects, but there had been aspects of her conduct that made continued employment inadvisable. She did not specify what those aspects were. Her tone was even and final, and carried within it the implication that the matter was closed. That she had said all she intended to say, and that any further curiosity on the subject would be received with courteous but unmistakable resistance. Miss Marple accepted this with a small nod, and turned the conversation towards the Women's Institute. But she had heard, in Mrs. Carrington's carefully measured words, something that interested her considerably. It was not what had been said. It was the quality of the saying, the slight over-precision of it, the way each syllable had been placed just so, as though the sentence had been rehearsed, or at the very least thought about in advance. There was, underneath the composure, the faint but discernible effort of maintenance. Like a well-tended garden in unsettled weather, Miss Marple thought. The appearance of order achieved through rather more exertion than the result would suggest. She stayed for the proper length of time, accepted a second cup of tea, and took her leave with every appearance of having had a perfectly pleasant afternoon. It was only the following morning, when she encountered Miss Beatrice Cole near the church gate, that she heard the detail about the uniform. Miss Beatrice Cole was a woman of about 40, unmarried, of modest independent means, and possessed of a directness that some found refreshing, and others found rather too much of a good thing before noon. She taught music to several of the village children, kept 3 cats, and held opinions on most subjects, which she expressed without undue hesitation. She was not, by temperament, a follower of convention, and this made her view of the Ashcombe House situation considerably different from that of most of her neighbours. She said from a reliable source that on the morning of Elsie Turner's departure, the girl's uniform had been found on the back staircase, folded, left there deliberately, by all appearances, rather than abandoned in haste or confusion. Miss Marple said that was most interesting. Miss Cole said she thought it was more than interesting. She thought it was indicative. A girl who takes the trouble to fold her uniform and leave it properly before departing is a girl who's made a decision. She's not running away. She's making a statement, quietly, without drama, but clearly enough for anyone who thinks to look. Miss Marple said that she agreed entirely. She reflected, as she made her way home along the lane, that the detail of the folded uniform was the kind of small thing that repaid considerable attention. It did not belong to the vocabulary of impulsive departure. A girl surprised into sudden dismissal, or overcome by distress, or fleeing something she could not face. Such a girl leaves her uniform on the hook behind the door, or across the foot of the bed, or draped over the chair where she has always draped it. She does not pause to fold it neatly and carry it to the back staircase and place it there for collection. The folding was deliberate. The placement on the back stair was deliberate. Both together suggested a mind still sufficiently composed at the moment of departure to attend to the proprieties, which meant that whatever Elsie Turner had understood or observed or felt about the situation at Ashcombe House, it had not overwhelmed her. She had left under her own authority, on her own terms, with her composure intact. That, in Miss Marple's experience, was not the behaviour of a girl who had been wrongly accused of something and did not know how to defend herself. It was the behaviour of a girl who knew precisely what she had seen and had made a considered choice about what to do with that knowledge. The lane was pleasant in the morning light. The hedgerows were thick with late June growth, and the air carried the faint sweetness of meadow grass from the fields beyond the church. A motor car passed at a moderate distance, disturbing a pair of sparrows from the top of the wall, and then the lane was quiet again. Miss Marple thought of the various people whose response to the situation had already reached her ears, carried on the usual currents of village exchange. There was Mrs. Lydia Grant, who lived in the handsome house on the corner of Church Road, and who had been one of Mrs. Carrington's firmest admirers for as long as anyone could recall. She was a tall, angular woman in her early 60s, with a devoted attachment to her own judgments and a habit of resolving any apparent contradiction in her understanding of the world by quietly discarding the contradicting element. She had said, with great confidence, that the girl had clearly been unreliable, that Mrs. Carrington was far too kind to say as much directly, and that the whole business had been managed with characteristic dignity. Mrs. Grant's loyalty, Miss Marple reflected, was the sincere and limited kind, sincere in its devotion, limited in its curiosity. Miss Cole herself, of course, took the opposite position with equal firmness, though her sympathy was directed towards the maid rather than the mistress. And then there was Mr. Stephen Carrington. He had arrived at Ashcombe House approximately 3 weeks before Elsie Turner's departure. He was Mrs. Carrington's nephew, her late husband's younger brother's son, a man of perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the confident and slightly undirected air of someone accustomed to comfort, without having worked especially hard to secure it. He had, it was understood, been staying at the house while he attended to some vaguely defined business matters in the vicinity. He was pleasant in company, spoke well, and had been seen at the village inn on 2 or 3 occasions, where he had made a generally agreeable impression without revealing very much about himself. And there was Mrs. Penelope Ward, who had been a frequent visitor to Ashcombe House throughout the spring, and whose name had been mentioned, carefully without elaboration, in connection with the household more than once in recent weeks. Miss Marple turned in at her garden gate. She would need, she thought, to learn rather more about both of them. Chapter 3. A Brooch on the Washstand. The opportunity presented itself, as opportunities in a village so often do through entirely natural and unmanufactured channels. Mrs. Carrington had mentioned, during Miss Marple's Thursday visit, that she intended to hold a small gathering the following Saturday. Nothing elaborate, she had said, just a few friends for afternoon tea, in the way she sometimes did in summer when the garden was looking its best. Miss Marple had been included in the invitation with the pleasant vagueness of one who assumes acceptance, and Miss Marple had accepted with the pleasant vagueness of one who does not wish to appear eager. It was an entirely satisfactory arrangement for both parties, and it meant that Miss Marple would have occasion to move through Ashcombe House in the natural course of an afternoon's visiting, which was precisely the kind of occasion she found most instructive. Saturday arrived with the good manners of late June at its most accommodating. The sky was a soft washed blue, and the air held the particular warmth that makes an English garden seem almost implausibly agreeable. Ashcombe House received its guests with every evidence of having been prepared for the purpose. The drawing-room was arranged with care, the garden chairs had been set out on the terrace, and flowers from the kitchen garden stood in clear glass vases on the table, where the tea things were laid. Mrs. Carrington moved among her visitors with the ease of long practice, and there was nothing about the afternoon, to an unprepared eye, that suggested anything other than a thoroughly pleasant occasion. There were 6 guests in addition to Miss Marple. Mrs. Lydia Grant arrived first, as she generally did at any gathering where punctuality might be interpreted as a mark of respect for the hostess. She was wearing her navy wool coat despite the warmth of the day, and she greeted Mrs. Carrington with the particular warmth of one ally, acknowledging another in the presence of a common uncertainty. Miss Cole came rather later, bringing with her a bunch of sweet peas from her own garden, and an expression of measured goodwill that suggested she had decided, for the afternoon at least, to hold her sharper opinions in reserve. Mrs. Penelope Ward arrived with the easy confidence of a person thoroughly at home in other people's houses, wearing a light summer dress in a shade of rose that suited her rather well, and carrying herself with a composure that was, Miss Marple thought, just a little too deliberate to be entirely natural. Mrs. Ward was a woman of about 42 or 43, with fair hair worn in soft curls and features that were pleasant rather than remarkable. She had been a widow for some years. Her husband, a solicitor from the neighbouring town, had died of a cardiac complaint some 5 years previously, and she had since occupied herself with the kind of active social life that fills the days of a woman of moderate means and considerable personal energy. She was known for her interest in other people's arrangements, for a laugh that was genuine if slightly too frequent, and for appearing in any room she entered, one to know exactly where the best chair was and to make her way toward it, without appearing to do so deliberately. She greeted Miss Marple with friendly warmth, inquired after her garden, and then turned the full weight of her attention upon Mrs. Carrington, who received it with a smile that was warmly returned, and, Miss Marple thought, very slightly watchful. Mr. Stephen Carrington was present also, which Miss Marple had half expected. He stood near the garden door with the particular ease of a man who considers himself, in any room that belongs to his family, to have certain natural rights of comfort. He was good-looking in the uncomplicated way of men who have never had cause to doubt their own impressions, and he spoke with a fluency that suggested he had spent a good many years being agreeable in drawing-rooms, without it ever having cost him very much. He was attentive to Mrs. Ward in the easy, undemonstrative way of two people who know each other well enough to require no particular effort, and Miss Marple observed, without appearing to observe, that they managed not to sit next to each other, and yet somehow contrived, over the course of the afternoon, to be in the same part of the room rather more often than chance alone would account for. It was during the natural movement of the afternoon, the small expeditions that such gatherings always produce, to collect a forgotten wrap, to consult a book mentioned in conversation, to make use of the upstairs facilities, that Miss Marple found herself on the first-floor landing. She had been shown by the new young housemaid to the bathroom at the end of the corridor. Returning along the landing, she paused, as elderly ladies are entirely entitled to do, to admire a small watercolour that hung near the window. It depicted a coastal scene in soft greens and greys, and was not without modest charm. The pause was genuine, but it also afforded an unhurried view of the open doorway to the guest bedroom, which stood slightly ajar in the way of a room that has been recently aired. Miss Marple did not enter the room. She had no need to. From her position at the watercolour, she could see quite clearly, on the washstand just inside the door, a small brooch. As it lay on the white linen runner with the slight displacement of an object recently set down rather than stored, as though it had been removed from a collar or a lapel and placed there for a moment and not yet returned to its proper place. It was a pretty thing, a spray of small flowers rendered in pale enamel and seed pearls, the kind of brooch a woman of taste might wear with a summer dress. Not an expensive piece, but not an insignificant one. It did not belong, Miss Marple was fairly certain, to Mrs. Eleanor Carrington. Mrs. Carrington's jewellery, what little she wore of it, ran to the subdued and the traditional, a good watch, the pearl strand, a plain gold brooch that had been her mother's. This little enamel spray was altogether different in character, lighter, more decorative, more expressive of personal whimsy. It belonged, so if Miss Marple were to place it, on the collar of a woman who dressed with a certain conscious pleasure in the effect, a woman, perhaps, in a rose-coloured summer dress. She returned downstairs without hurrying, accepted a second cup of tea from the new girl, who managed the pouring with improved confidence, and listened with every appearance of full attention to Mrs. Grant's views on the forthcoming church fete. Later, as the afternoon drew toward its close, and the guests began to take their leave in the unhurried way of those who have had a pleasant time and are not quite ready to relinquish it, Miss Marple found herself beside Mrs. Carrington, near the garden door. She mentioned the watercolour, the coastal scene in the upstairs corridor. She said she'd paused to look at it on her way back from the landing. She asked, with genuine interest, whether it was a local artist. Mrs. Carrington said it had been painted by her husband's sister, who had been rather talented. She spoke of it with the mild fondness of a possession valued for its associations rather than its quality. Then, as if the thought had arrived entirely of its own accord, Miss Marple mentioned that she had noticed a very charming brooch on the washstand in the guest room. A little enamel spray, she said. She hoped she had not intruded by looking in. The door had been open, and the light had caught it rather prettily. Mrs. Carrington's expression did not change in any way that another person would have noticed. There was simply a small, smooth pause, the length of a drawn breath, before she said that it was a misplaced item, nothing of consequence, a thing left about by a visitor. For Miss Marple said that it was very pretty, and thought no more of it aloud. But she walked home through the mild early evening with the steady, unhurried attentiveness of a person in whose mind something small and clear has just taken its proper place. Misplaced objects were not, in her experience, generally misplaced. They arrived where they arrived because someone had put them there, and the questions worth asking were not where an object had been left, but whose it was, and why the explanation offered for its presence had the quality, smooth, immediate, complete, of a sentence prepared in advance of the question. The rose-coloured dress, she thought, had suited Mrs. Ward very well. The evening was warm and the lane smelled of cut grass and something faintly honeyed from the hedgerows. A blackbird somewhere to her left was delivering his last considerable thoughts on the subject of the day. Miss Marple listened to him with appreciation and walked on. Chapter 4. A door closed before dinner. There is a particular kind of knowledge that arrives not all at once but in gradual accumulation, the way a picture emerges from a developing tray, first an outline, then a shape, then the slow resolution of detail until something recognizable and specific comes clear. Miss Marple had learned, over the course of a long and observant life, to be patient with this process. It could not be hurried. It could only be assisted by the kind of quiet, unhurried attention that most people, being occupied with their own affairs, were too busy to provide. She turned her attention, in the days following the Saturday gathering, toward the question of what exactly had been happening within Ashcombe House in the period immediately before Elsie Turner's departure. The household's routines were not difficult to reconstruct in general outline. Mrs. Carrington kept a regular and well-ordered establishment. Meals were served at consistent hours. Visitors were received on customary afternoons. The domestic arrangements had a settled predictability that had been its defining character for years, and it was against this background of regularity that any deviation, however small, would naturally stand out. It was Miss Beatrice Cole who provided the next useful thread, though she did so without any particular awareness of its significance. Miss Marple encountered her on Monday morning at the lending library, where they had both arrived at approximately the same moment and fell naturally into company, while Miss Cole returned a volume of collected essays, and Miss Marple selected a new detective novel with the conscientiousness of someone who takes the genre seriously. Their conversation moved through several subjects in the easy, unhurried way of two people with no pressing engagements, and it was only when they had stepped out together onto the pavement and begun walking in the same direction that Miss Cole mentioned, almost incidentally, that she had been calling at Ashcombe House on the evening before Elsie Turner left. Miss Marple expressed mild interest and asked whether it had been a pleasant visit. Miss Cole said it had been perfectly agreeable, though rather shorter than she had anticipated. She had called at about 6:30 with the intention of returning a book she had borrowed from Mrs. Carrington some weeks previously. She had been shown into the drawing-room, where she waited for a few minutes before Mrs. Carrington appeared, and then they had talked for perhaps a quarter of an hour before Miss Cole had taken her leave. It was nothing out of the ordinary, she said, and yet there had been something about the house that evening that had struck her as slightly different from its usual character, though she had not thought about it again until recently. Miss Marple asked, with the gentle curiosity of someone who asks merely for the pleasure of understanding, what sort of difference she had noticed. Miss Cole considered this with the seriousness she brought to most questions. The drawing-room had been exactly as it always was, she said. Mrs. Carrington had been composed and pleasant, if perhaps a little more careful in her conversation than was quite natural. But it was when she had arrived at the front door and been waiting on the step for it to be answered that she had noticed, through the transom window above the door, that one of the upstairs rooms had its door closed. This would not ordinarily have been noteworthy. Doors in private houses are closed for any number of entirely unremarkable reasons. But Miss Cole was a person of detail, and she had been a fairly regular visitor to Ashcombe House over the years, and she said that the particular door in question, which she believed to be the door of the guest bedroom at the front of the house, was, in her experience, almost invariably left open during the daytime hours. Mrs. Carrington had a habit of keeping interior doors ajar when rooms were in use, for the circulation of air. The sight of it closed, on an evening that was, if anything rather warm, had struck her as slightly at odds with the usual arrangements. It had been closed well before the dinner hour, certainly by 6:30, perhaps earlier. Miss Marple thanked her for a most interesting conversation, admired a particularly handsome window box on the wall of the post office, and turned toward home with the quiet sense of a woman who has just acquired something worth examining. She thought as she walked about doors. The guest bedroom at Ashcombe House was the room where she'd observed the brooch on the washstand. It was also, she now understood, the room that had a visitor, or had been prepared for one, on the evening before Elsie Turner's departure. The hat box, which she had not yet seen but which had been mentioned to her in passing by Mrs. Grant, who had been given a brief tour of the house some weeks previously, and had remarked upon a visitor's belongings in the spare room, suggested that the occupancy was not temporary in the hurried sense. A hat box indicated something between a weekend stay and a lengthier arrangement, and the door, closed before dinner on a warm evening in the guest room that faced the front of the house, where anyone approaching along the gravel path might see the window, closed, Miss Marple reflected, to prevent observation from outside, or to contain whatever was occurring within. She was not yet in a position to say with confidence precisely what that was, but the shape of the thing was becoming clearer, in the gradual, patient way of developing pictures. She thought about Elsie Turner, a young woman of 22 or 23 placed in a well-ordered household, accustomed to its routines, attentive to her duties. Such a girl would know the rhythms of the house as well as its mistress did, and probably better in some respects, because the work of a household is carried out not in its drawing rooms, but in its passages and on its staircases and behind its closed doors, and a conscientious servant notices a great deal that a preoccupied employer does not consider worth concealing. What had Elsie Turner noticed? She had noticed enough to write a note, which she had not left openly but had placed with care in a location where it might be found. She had not addressed it, which meant she had not known, or had not decided, who should receive it. She had used language that was careful and suggestive rather than explicit, which meant she understood that she was navigating territory where plain speech carried consequences. She had, in other words, behaved as a person behaves when they are aware of something they feel cannot be entirely ignored, but also cannot be safely stated. Miss Marple found this picture of the girl considerably more sympathetic and more interesting than the vague term unsuitable had suggested. The lane that curved past the church was dappled with leaf shadow, and very quiet in the middle of the morning. A tabby cat belonging to the sexton's wife observed Miss Marple from the top of the churchyard wall with the benign indifference of a creature whose curiosity has long since been satisfied by the world's consistency. Miss Marple acknowledged it with a small nod and walked on. She was thinking now about Mrs. Carrington's position in all of this, which was, she considered, genuinely complicated. A woman of her standing, in a household of her character, with a nephew staying and a friend whose visits were becoming a matter of village remark. Such a woman had a great many things to manage simultaneously, and managing them required above all the appearance of perfect order. A maid who had begun to notice that the appearance of order and the reality of it were not quite aligned was not, from that perspective, a maid who could safely remain. Mrs. Carrington had acted in her own terms rationally. What she could not have entirely controlled was what the girl chose to leave behind. A folded uniform on the back stair, a note beneath the tray cloth, and a brooch on a washstand that had been there. Miss Marple was now fairly certain, not by accident, but because its owner had left the house, in rather more of a hurry than was typical, and had overlooked it in consequence. The morning continued agreeably around her. Miss Marple reached her garden gate and let herself in, and went directly to her chair by the sitting-room window, where her knitting waited, and the light was very good. She had, she thought, rather a lot to consider. Chapter 5. A note slipped beneath the tray cloth. There are people in every village who know a great deal more than they are generally given credit for, and who say a great deal less than they know. This is not, as it might appear, a form of deception. It is more often a form of self-preservation, the quiet instinct of those who have learned, through experience or observation, that speech in the wrong moment to the wrong person tends to produce consequences that silence would have avoided entirely. Miss Marple was reflecting upon this on Tuesday morning when she received a visit from Mrs. Dolly Bantry. Dolly arrived with a pot of her own plum jam and the air of someone carrying news of moderate importance, which she had been restraining with some effort since at least the previous evening. She accepted tea, set the jam on the kitchen table and said, without very much preamble, that she had heard something about the Carrington business that she thought Miss Marple ought to know. Miss Marple said she was most interested and poured the tea. It had come, Dolly said, from her cleaning woman, Mrs. Pringle, who was the sister-in-law of a woman called Agnes Barlow, who had been the daily help at Ashcombe House for some years, and continued in that position still. Agnes Barlow was not, by reputation, a woman given to idle talk. She was a stout, capable person of about 50, who had been cleaning other people's houses since she was 17, and had developed, over the course of that occupation, a philosophic attitude toward the secrets that inhabited domestic interiors. She did not discuss what she found as a general rule, but she had told her sister-in-law, and her sister-in-law had told Mrs. Pringle, and Mrs. Pringle had told Dolly that there had been a note. Miss Marple set down her cup with perfect composure and said that a note was most interesting. The note, as it had been passed along this chain of reliable women, had been found by Agnes Barlow herself on the morning of Elsie Turner's departure, while she was laying up the dining room for breakfast, It had been beneath the tray cloth, the small linen cloth that sat beneath the toast rack, which was the sort of place that might not be disturbed for several days if no one was looking particularly carefully. Agnes had found it when she lifted the cloth to launder it. She had read it because she was a sensible woman and had thought, in the circumstances, that she ought to know what it said. And then she'd given it to Mrs. Carrington, who'd received it with a stillness that Agnes had described to her sister-in-law as unnatural. The note, as Agnes had reported its contents, was not long. It was written in a neat, careful hand. Elsie Turner, whatever else might be said of her, had been to a decent village school and had not neglected her penmanship. It said that the writer had not found it possible to continue in her position, and that she did not feel comfortable remaining in a house where certain things were occurring that did not seem right to her. It said that she did not wish to cause trouble, and that she had thought very carefully about what to say and how to say it, and it said that she hoped whoever found the note would understand that she had not acted out of malice, yes, but only out of a sincere uncertainty about what the right thing to do was. It was not addressed. It named no one. It described nothing specifically. Miss Marple listened to this account with a kind of attention that is perfectly still on the surface, and very active immediately below it. When Dolly had finished, she said that she thought the girl had chosen her words with considerable care. Dolly agreed that it was rather more thoughtfully expressed than she might have expected from a young maid of 22. Miss Marple said that this was perhaps exactly the point. She explained, gently and without any air of instructing, that a note of that particular character was not the work of someone writing in distress or writing in anger. Both of those states produced a different kind of language, looser, less controlled, inclined toward the specific and the accusatory. This note had none of those qualities. Its language was guarded not because the writer lacked the words to be direct, but because she had understood, with a clarity that was quite remarkable in a young woman of her age and position, that directness would serve no one well, including herself. Dolly said she supposed that was true, and helped herself to a biscuit. Miss Marple continued, more to herself than to her companion, that the note's careful avoidance of names and particulars told one rather a lot about what Elsie Turner had understood of her own situation. She had known what she had seen. She had known that she could not unsee it. She had known equally that to speak of it plainly, to name the people involved, and to describe the circumstances directly, would expose her to exactly the kind of dismissal that had eventually come anyway, but with the added disadvantage of having made an accusation she could not substantiate, and would almost certainly not be believed in making. So she had chosen a middle course. She had communicated the fact of her discomfort without specifying its cause. She had made it clear that something was wrong without making it possible for anyone to say precisely what she had meant. It was, Miss Marple said, rather cleverly done for someone with no experience of such situations. Dolly asked whether Miss Marple thought the girl had suspected that Mrs. Carrington already knew what was happening under her own roof. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, in the way she was sometimes quiet when a question required more than its surface suggested. She said that this was perhaps the most interesting question of all. There were, she said, two distinct possibilities. The first was that Elsie Turner had discovered something that Mrs. Carrington herself was not aware of, some private arrangement between her nephew and her friend that had been conducted with sufficient discretion to escape the mistress of the house entirely. In that case, the note might have been a form of indirect communication, an attempt to bring Mrs. Carrington's attention to a matter she had not yet perceived. The second possibility was considerably more uncomfortable. It was that Mrs. Carrington was aware, at least in general terms, of the situation between Mr. Stephen Carrington and Mrs. Ward, and had chosen, for reasons of her own, family loyalty, social calculation, the desire to manage appearances, to permit it to continue in the hope that it would resolve itself quietly. In that case, the note was not a revelation. It was a complication. It told Mrs. Carrington that the situation had been observed by someone who was not prepared to be entirely silent about it, which meant that the calculation she had been making in private was now subject to external pressure. And that, said Miss Marple, would explain the quality of Mrs. Carrington's response very neatly. She had not been shocked. She had been inconvenienced. Dolly said that this seemed rather hard on the poor girl, who had only been trying to do what she thought was right. Miss Marple inclined her head in full agreement. It was hard on her, she said. The difficulty was that Elsie Turner, in constructing her careful, restrained, considerate note, had not accounted for one very important aspect of the situation. She had imagined that the person who found it would respond to its implicit appeal to conscience. She had not fully considered that the person who found it might have a conscience already thoroughly occupied with its own arrangements. The morning light lay pleasantly across the sitting-room floor, and a bee that had drifted in through the open window made a brief and decisive tour of the window-sill before finding its way out again. The plum jam on the kitchen table would be very good on toast, Miss Marple thought, and she must remember to say so. Dolly asked whether Miss Marple thought she ought to do anything about any of this. Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said that she did not think there was at this moment very much that could usefully be done. The situation was not yet fully clear to her. There were details she did not yet understand, and she had always found it considerably more effective to wait until one had a complete picture before attempting to act upon it. She also said, and here she spoke with a quietness that Dolly recognized as meaning, she was saying something she intended to be heard, that she thought it would be worth someone taking the trouble to find out where Elsie Turner had gone. Not to speak to her, necessarily. Not yet. Simply to know where she was. Dolly said she thought Mrs. Pringle might know, as these things tended to travel along the same channels that everything else did. Miss Marple said that she thought this was very likely indeed. Chapter 6. Curtains drawn in the afternoon. Wednesday in St. Mary Mead was, by long-established custom, the day on which a certain number of its inhabitants called upon a certain other number, drank tea, exchanged observations on subjects of local interest, and returned home with a clearer understanding of the village's current state of feeling than any amount of solitary reflection could have produced. It was not a formal arrangement. No one had designated Wednesday for this purpose. It had simply become so, in the way that many village customs become so, through repetition, convenience, and the gradual hardening of habit into something that feels almost like nature. Miss Marple found Wednesday useful. She had, that particular Wednesday, a conversation with Mrs. Penelope Ward. It had not been difficult to arrange. Mrs. Ward, as Miss Marple had observed, was a woman who enjoyed social contact and maintained a reasonably active presence in village life. She attended the same church, patronised the same lending library, and was on sufficiently pleasant terms with enough of the same people that an encounter could be brought about through the simple expedient of knowing where she was likely to be at a given hour. On Wednesday mornings, Mrs. Ward generally called in at the small draper's shop near the post office, where she had a long-standing arrangement with the proprietress regarding the supply of certain embroidery silks that were not otherwise easily obtained in the area. Miss Marple required some new darning wool. They met, as these things are arranged to meet, with every appearance of coincidence. Mrs. Ward was in good spirits. She was dressed in a lightweight coat of pale cream that suited the morning well, and she carried herself with the easy assurance that Miss Marple had noted at the Saturday gathering. A composed, pleasant woman who understood the social landscape she moved through and navigated it without apparent effort. She greeted Miss Marple with genuine warmth, inquired after her health, and fell naturally into step beside her as they both moved toward the door. They walked a short distance along the lane together, as one does after a chance encounter when neither party has any pressing reason to diverge, and their conversation moved through the agreeable shallows of morning talk. The weather, the success of the Saturday tea, the question of whether the church fete would be blessed with the same cooperative weather it had enjoyed the previous year. It was Mrs. Ward herself who introduced the subject of Ashcombe House, which saved Miss Marple the mild trouble of doing so herself. She said that she'd been a little concerned about Mrs. Carrington lately. Eleanor, she said, using the Christian name with the ease of genuine intimacy, had seemed somewhat more strained than usual at the Saturday gathering, though she concealed it admirably. The business with the maid had clearly been more unsettling than she was willing to show. Mrs. Ward said this with the warm solicitude of a close friend, and Miss Marple noted the solicitude, and noted also the very slight care with which it was expressed. Miss Marple said that it was always taxing to manage household disruptions, particularly in an establishment as well-ordered as Ashcombe House. Mrs. Ward agreed. She said that Eleanor had been managing a good deal lately, between the household and the presence of guests, and that it was sometimes difficult for a woman in her position to acknowledge that she found things tiring. Miss Marple said, with mild interest, that she imagined the additional company had been both a pleasure and a slight complication. Mrs. Ward said yes, she supposed it had. She did not elaborate further, and the slight pause that followed suggested she had decided, with the ease of practice, that the subject had been adequately addressed. It was several moments later, when they had turned the conversation toward the garden at Ashcombe House and its particular success with roses, that Mrs. Ward mentioned as a detail of no especial importance that on her last visit before the Saturday gathering she had found the drawing-room curtains drawn when she arrived, which had struck her as unusual for that hour of the afternoon. It had still been quite bright outside, she said. She had assumed there was some practical reason for it. Miss Marple said that she had heard something similar mentioned. Mrs. Ward said that Mrs. Carrington had explained it was the heat, which had been considerable that particular afternoon. Miss Marple observed, in the pleasantly agreeable tone of someone making conversation rather than a point, that she had not found that week especially warm herself. Rather mild, she would have said for late June. Mrs. Ward looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, for just that moment, rather more attentive than the conversation seemed to warrant. Then she smiled and said that she supposed people felt the heat very differently, and that Eleanor had always been more sensitive to it than most. They parted shortly afterward with mutual expressions of goodwill, and Miss Marple walked home in the measured, unhurried way of someone who has heard something instructive and is in no hurry to reach a conclusion about it before it has been fully absorbed. She thought about curtains. The drawing-room at Ashcombe House faced the front of the property. Its windows looked directly onto the gravel path and beyond the copper beech hedge to the lane. Anyone walking along the lane in the afternoon could see, at a glance, whether the drawing-room was in use and by whom, in the way that one can always see more of the interior of a room from bright outdoor light than those within the room might suppose. Afternoon callers, approaching along the path, would have a clear view of the window before they reached the door. Drawn curtains in the afternoon therefore served a double purpose. They blocked the view from the lane, and they gave no indication to anyone who might be approaching of what was occurring within. Miss Marple found this rather more explanatory than the heat. She thought about Mrs. Ward's expression in that brief attentive moment, the small, swift recalibration of a woman who has just understood that the person she's talking to is not quite as comfortably unobservant as she had assumed. It was not an alarmed expression. It was more the expression of a person who has been playing a card game with easy confidence and has caught a glimpse in the reflection of the window of another player's hand. Not enough to change the game entirely, enough to increase the degree of care applied to subsequent moves. Miss Marple did not find this troubling. She found it, if anything, clarifying. She had not been entirely certain, before the conversation, whether Mrs. Ward was a woman who knew everything, a woman who knew something, or a woman who suspected without fully knowing. The expression in the lane had answered at least one of those questions. Mrs. Ward knew something. Whether she knew everything was not yet clear. But she was not a passive figure in the situation at Ashcombe House. She was an active one. Then, and the care she took in her conversations about it was the care of a person who has a specific interest in how those conversations conclude. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden with her knitting and thought carefully about the shape of what she now understood. There was, at the centre of the matter, a private arrangement between Mr. Stephen Carrington and Mrs. Penelope Ward, an intimacy conducted within Mrs. Carrington's house, whether with or without her knowledge, that had been observed by a young maid who had not known quite what to do with what she had seen. The maid had left. The arrangement, whatever its precise nature, was still in some form of operation, Since Mrs. Ward continued to call at Ashcombe House, and Mr. Stephen Carrington had not yet departed the village. The curtains drawn in the afternoon were not, Miss Marple thought, an isolated event. They were part of a pattern of management. The management of appearances, the careful arrangement of surfaces, the small domestic decisions that allowed something to continue without being directly acknowledged. She considered Mrs. Carrington again, a woman of composure and intelligence, who had constructed an orderly life and maintained it with consistent effort, and who was now managing within her own household a situation that compromised everything she had built. The question that continued to occupy Miss Marple was not what had happened. That, she thought, was becoming tolerably clear, but what Mrs. Carrington had decided to do about it, and why. The clematis on the south wall of her cottage was performing well this year. A small tortoiseshell butterfly settled briefly on the arm of her garden chair and then departed. The village continued its Wednesday afternoon in the comfortable, unhurried fashion that was one of its more endearing qualities. Miss Marple turned her knitting and counted her stitches, and thought about what it might mean to be a woman who preferred, above almost everything, the appearance of order, and what it might cost to maintain that preference when the disorder was not outside the gates, but within the house itself. Chapter 7. A hat box in the spare bedroom. There are moments in the course of any investigation. For Miss Marple, in her private and entirely unofficial way, did conduct investigations, though she would have described what she did in considerably more modest terms, when the accumulation of small details reaches a point at which they begin, quite naturally, to arrange themselves into a coherent account. It is not a sudden thing. It does not arrive with any particular announcement. It is more the feeling of a room slowly coming into focus as the morning light strengthens, until shapes that were indistinct resolve themselves, one by one, into familiar and explicable objects. Miss Marple had reached something approaching that feeling by Thursday morning. What she required now was not more evidence. She had, she thought, quite sufficient evidence for the purposes of understanding, but confirmation of one or two details that would allow her to say, with the certainty she preferred before speaking, that her understanding was correct and not merely plausible. There is a considerable difference between a theory that fits the known facts and a theory that is true, and Miss Marple had lived long enough to be suspicious of the former when it had not yet earned the right to claim the latter. The hat box was one such detail. She had heard it mentioned, as she had noted privately some days ago, by Mrs. Lydia Grant, who had been given a brief and no doubt carefully conducted tour of certain rooms at Ashcombe House some weeks previously, during a visit she had described to several people as most enjoyable. Mrs. Grant was not the most perceptive of observers, but she was a thorough one, in the way that people are thorough when they pay close attention to things they consider worth admiring. She had mentioned the hat box in passing, as an example of how thoughtfully Mrs. Carrington arranged for her guests, a large, rather handsome box of pale grey with a silk cord handle, left in the spare bedroom because the visitor who had brought it had been prevailed upon to extend her stay. Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Grant on Thursday morning with a small jar of the blackcurrant preserve that Mrs. Grant was known to be fond of, and a question about a knitting pattern she had been unable to locate, which gave the visit its necessary domestic character. Mrs. Grant received her in the front sitting-room, which was arranged with the careful tidiness of a woman who considers her domestic surroundings a direct reflection of her personal standards. Everything in it was good and well maintained and placed exactly where it should be. The china on the dresser was spode. The curtains were a deep, reliable green. The antimacassars were laundered to a whiteness that suggested they were laundered rather often. Over tea and the blackcurrant preserve, which was declared excellent and entirely superior to the shop variety, Mrs. Grant spoke freely about Ashcombe House and Mrs. Carrington, as she always did when the subject was introduced, which was the conversational equivalent of opening a well-oiled door. She had, she said, always considered Ashcombe House one of the best managed establishments in the village. Mrs. Carrington had standards, supped and maintained them without apparent effort, which was the mark of a woman who had been raised properly, Everything about the house was as it should be. Even when there were guests, the household ran without disruption, and she had been struck during her visit some weeks ago by how thoroughly accommodating the arrangements were. Miss Marple said that Mrs. Carrington had always struck her as a most capable and considerate hostess. Mrs. Grant said yes, and that the guest arrangements in particular had been charming. The spare bedroom had been made up beautifully, fresh flowers, the very best linen, and the visitor who was using it, though Mrs. Grant had not been introduced, had clearly been settled in for a comfortable stay. She had noticed a very handsome hat-box on the chest of drawers and a small dressing case on the window seat, and a number of other small indications that the room had been occupied with the quiet thoroughness of someone who intended to remain for more than a night or two. Miss Marple asked, with the absent curiosity of someone whose mind is only partially engaged with the question, whether Mrs. Grant had known who the visitor was. Mrs. Grant said she had not. Mrs. Carrington had mentioned only that a friend was staying. She had said it in the way one says such things when one does not particularly intend to elaborate, and Mrs. Grant, who respected the right of a person to manage their own household arrangements without explanation, had not asked further. Miss Marple said that this was very considerate of her. She turned the conversation, after a suitable interval, to the knitting pattern, which Mrs. Grant was able to locate from a drawer in the bureau with only moderate difficulty, and they spent a pleasant quarter of an hour discussing the relative merits of various tensions for that particular stitch, before Miss Marple took her leave. She walked home with two things clearly in her mind. The first was that the visitor in the spare bedroom, the owner of the hat-box, the dressing case, and the rose-coloured dress with its enamel brooch, had been in residence at Ashcombe House for a period of some days at least, and quite possibly longer. The duration of the stay was consistent with an arrangement that had been made with some degree of intention, not a brief and informal visit between friends. The second was that Mrs. Carrington had not introduced this visitor to Mrs. Grant, which was, in the context of Mrs. Carrington's otherwise meticulous social management, a notable omission. Mrs. Carrington introduced her guests. It was part of the fabric of her hospitality, the way a well-conducted household always presented its members to one another with the smooth ease of an establishment that had nothing to conceal. The fact that she had not done so in this instance meant either that the visitor was absent at the time, possible but not certain, or that she had on this occasion preferred that the visitor remain unidentified. A visitor who was better not identified was a visitor whose presence required explanation. Miss Marple thought about Mrs. Penelope Ward, who had a pleasant house of her own not 3 miles distant, who had been a fixture at Ashcombe House throughout the spring, and who had given every appearance at the Saturday gathering of being a woman entirely at home in the room she was moving through. She thought about Mr. Stephen Carrington, who had been in residence at Ashcombe House for approximately 3 weeks before Elsie Turner's departure, who was handsome and pleasant, and not, in Miss Marple's estimation, a man burdened with an excess of moral scruple. She thought about Mrs. Carrington herself, a woman who had, at the Saturday gathering, greeted Mrs. Ward with a warmth that was genuine and watchful in precisely equal measure. Not the warmth of a woman greeting an entirely innocent friend, not the coldness of a woman greeting someone she considered an enemy, something more complicated than either. The warmth, perhaps, of a woman who has made a calculation and is committed to it, and finds in the presence of the person who necessitated it a reminder of the cost. There were households, Miss Marple reflected, where a great deal was managed rather than resolved, where inconvenient truths were accommodated rather than confronted, where the surface of things was maintained with such consistent effort that the surface eventually became, for practical purposes, the reality, at least for everyone who lived within it, and chose not to look too carefully at the foundations. Ashcombe House, she thought, had been such a household for some time, possibly longer than the present situation had been in operation. She reached her garden gate and paused there for a moment, looking back along the lane. The copper beeches at the far end of the village were very dark and very still in the Thursday morning light. A woman with a shopping basket was making her way toward the post office. Two children on bicycles passed with the focused concentration of people, going somewhere specific at a rate that would probably get them there before they had intended. The village was entirely itself, untroubled and unhurried. Somewhere within it, in whatever modest accommodation she had found since her departure from Ashcombe House, Elsie Turner was, presumably, going about the quieter business of her own days. Miss Marple had not yet had occasion to speak with her. She had not sought her out deliberately, because she had felt, until now, that she did not yet know enough to ask the right questions. She thought that she was close to knowing enough. A hat box in a spare bedroom, a brooch on a washstand, a door closed before dinner, a note beneath the tray cloth, the curtains drawn in the afternoon. Each detail considered individually meant very little. Considered together, they described a situation with a coherence and a sadness that Miss Marple found, as she always found such things, both entirely human and entirely unsurprising. She let herself in through the garden gate and went inside to write a note of her own. Chapter 8. Footsteps. Pausing on the staircase landing. The note Miss Marple had written on Thursday evening was a brief and entirely friendly communication, addressed to Mrs. Dolly Bantry, asking whether she had, as she had suggested she might, made any inquiries through Mrs. Pringle regarding the present whereabouts of Elsie Turner. It was not an urgent note. It was phrased in the mild, unhurried tone of someone who is interested in the answer, but not dependent upon it arriving at any particular speed. Miss Marple had found, over many years, that notes written in that tone tended to produce results rather more quickly than notes that conveyed any impression of urgency, which had the curious effect of making their recipients feel that they were being hurried, and therefore inclined them, consciously or otherwise, to take their time. Dolly appeared at the cottage on Friday morning, which was satisfactorily prompt. She had, she said, spoken to Mrs. Pringle, who had spoken to Agnes Barlow, and the result of these inquiries was that Elsie Turner had taken a position with a family called Henderton, who lived in a village called Witchford, which was approximately 8 miles distant in the direction of the market town. The Hendertons were a quiet family, a retired schoolmaster and his wife, and Elsie had been with them for a little over a fortnight. Mrs. Pringle had thought the girl seemed settled enough, though the wages were modest, and the household considerably less demanding than Ashcombe House had been. Miss Marple thanked Dolly sincerely, and said that she found this most helpful. Dolly, who was nobody's fool despite occasional appearances to the contrary, asked whether Miss Marple intended to call upon the girl. Miss Marple said that she thought she might, in due course. She was not yet quite ready to do so. There was one further matter she wished to attend to first, and for that she required, if Dolly did not mind, a little more of her company and the use of her motor car. Dolly said she was entirely at Miss Marple's disposal, which was the kind of thing she said and generally meant. They drove, on Saturday afternoon, to Ashcombe House, not as visitors this time, but with a purpose that was rather more specific. Miss Marple had arranged, through a brief and friendly word at the church door on Sunday previous, to call upon Agnes Barlow at the hour when Agnes customarily finished her work for the day. Agnes Barlow had agreed to this with the measured cooperation of a woman who sees no reason to be unhelpful, and several reasons to be otherwise. Agnes received them in the small sitting room that Mrs. Carrington provided for the use of her domestic staff, a pleasant, simply furnished room at the back of the house that looked onto the kitchen garden. She was, as her reputation suggested, a composed and practical woman, not disposed to elaboration, but equally not disposed to evasion. She sat across from Miss Marple with her hands folded on her lap, and looked at her guest with the attentive patience of someone who has agreed to answer questions and intends to do so accurately. Miss Marple thanked her for her time and said that she had only 1 or 2 things she wished to ask about, and that she hoped Agnes would understand that her interest in the matter arose entirely from concern for the welfare of a young woman who had found herself in a difficult position through no particular fault of her own. Agnes said that she understood that, and that she had thought much the same herself. Miss Marple asked whether, in the weeks before Elsie Turner's departure, Agnes had observed anything in the house that had struck her as unusual. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone collecting a fabrication, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of what they know to offer, and in what order. She said that there had been one evening, perhaps 10 days before the girl left, when she'd arrived to collect a forgotten item, her reading spectacles, left on the kitchen windowsill at an hour later than her usual finishing time. It had been about 9 o'clock in the evening, and she had let herself in through the back door as she was permitted to do. The kitchen was empty and the house was quiet. She had collected her spectacles and was about to leave when she heard footsteps on the staircase. They had paused on the landing. She had not thought very much of it at the time. People pause on landings for any number of reasons: to look from a window, to collect a thought, to decide which direction to proceed. But these footsteps had paused for rather longer than that. Not a brief hesitation, but a sustained stillness, as though the person on the landing was listening or considering or both. And then, after perhaps half a minute, the footsteps had continued, not downward, as she might have expected, but back along the upper corridor in the direction they had come from. Miss Marple asked whether she could form any impression of whose footsteps they had been. Agnes said she could not say for certain. They were not heavy footsteps. Not a man's, she thought, or at least not a large man, and they had moved with a kind of deliberateness that she associated with someone who was paying attention to where they were putting their feet. Miss Marple nodded and asked whether Elsie Turner had been in the house at that hour. Agnes said that Elsie's room was on the upper floor, and that she had no way of knowing whether the girl had been in her room or elsewhere. She had not seen her that evening. Miss Marple thanked her for this and asked one further question. She asked whether, in Agnes's observation, Mrs. Carrington had seemed during the weeks in question to be under any particular strain. Agnes considered this with the care she brought to everything. She said that Mrs. Carrington was not a woman who showed strain openly, but she had, in those weeks, been rather more particular than usual about certain domestic details. More attentive, for instance, to which rooms were locked and which were left open, more specific about which areas of the house she wished Agnes to attend to, and which she preferred to manage herself. Small things, individually. But Agnes was a woman who had spent 30 years observing the way households behaved, and she had learned to read the difference between a mistress who was particular because she was particular, and a mistress who was particular because she was managing something. Miss Marple said that this was exactly the kind of observation she had hoped for, and thanked Agnes with the genuine warmth of someone who means it. They drove back through the late Saturday afternoon along roads that were bright with summer and empty of traffic, and Dolly, who had sat quietly through the conversation at Ashcombe House with admirable restraint, said that the footsteps on the landing were suggestive. Miss Marple said that they were rather more than suggestive. She thought about those pausing footsteps as the hedgerows moved past the window, someone on the upper landing at 9 o'clock in the evening listening or deciding. She thought it unlikely to have been Agnes, who had come in and gone out again through the kitchen. She thought it unlikely to have been Mrs. Carrington, whose movements in her own house tended to be directed and unambiguous. The hesitation that sustained deliberate pause belonged, in her experience, to someone who had not yet fully committed to a course of action, or who had just understood something that required them to reconsider the course they were already on. Elsie Turner, she thought, had been a conscientious girl, a girl who observed things and thought about them, a girl who did not act impulsively. The footsteps on the landing, pausing in that particular way at that particular hour, had the quality of a decision being approached, and perhaps taken. The note beneath the tray cloth had been written shortly thereafter. The uniform had been folded with great care. The departure had followed. The sequence made a kind of quiet, unhappy sense that Miss Marple found both entirely coherent and genuinely sad. A young woman, alone in a house that was managing its own difficulties above and below stairs, standing on a landing in the dark and deciding whether honesty was worth its cost. Deciding finally that it was, though not quite the honesty she had originally considered, and not in quite the form she might have imagined. What Elsie Turner had done was careful, but careful, as Miss Marple had cause to know, was not always the same as safe. She would call at Witchford, she decided, on Monday. The evening was very pleasant on the road home, and the light was that particular golden quality that arrives in the last hours of a long June day, when everything it touches looks more itself than usual, and the familiar becomes briefly and inexplicably luminous. Dolly said it was a beautiful evening. Miss Marple agreed that it was. Chapter 9. Why the Maid Chose Her Words. Witchford was a village of modest proportions and no particular distinction, situated along a road that wound through level farmland with the unhurried indirection of a path that had been made by people with no particular reason to hurry. It had a church, a post office, a public house of reasonable character, and a small green around which its principal houses arranged themselves with the self-contained satisfaction of a community that had long since decided it was sufficient unto itself. Miss Marple, who had a genuine appreciation for villages that knew what they were, found it agreeable. The Henderton house was a neat cream-painted cottage on the eastern side of the green, a siesta, with a well-kept garden and a brass knocker polished to a degree that suggested either considerable pride or considerable time. Dolly waited in the motor car with a novel and a thermos flask of coffee, which she had brought with the foresight of a woman accustomed to Miss Marple's visiting habits. Miss Marple knocked and was received by Mrs. Henderton, a small bespectacled woman of 60 or so, who had the composed and slightly watchful manner of a person accustomed to assessing unexpected callers with quiet efficiency. Miss Marple introduced herself with the pleasant simplicity that served her on such occasions. A neighbour, she said, of Mrs. Carrington's in St. Mary Mead, who had heard that Elsie Turner had found a position with the Hendertons and wished, if Elsie were agreeable and Mrs. Henderton had no objection, to have a brief word with her on a matter relating to her previous employment. Mrs. Henderton considered this for a moment, and then said that she supposed it would be all right, and showed Miss Marple into a small, well-ordered sitting room that smelled of lavender and recently applied furniture polish. She went to find Elsie, with the air of someone reserving final judgment. Elsie Turner arrived after a few minutes. She was, as Miss Marple had formed from the collective account of her, a young woman of plain and open appearance, a round, honest face, brown hair drawn back with practical tidiness, and the careful posture of a person who has been taught to conduct herself properly in the presence of her employer's acquaintances. She was wearing her working dress, a dark navy with a white collar, and she carried herself with a composure that Miss Marple thought had been assembled for the occasion with some deliberate effort. Her eyes, which were a steady grey-brown, assessed Miss Marple with an intelligence that was not unfriendly, but was not incautious either. Miss Marple gestured to the chair beside her, and said that she hoped Elsie did not mind her calling, and that she wished to speak quite frankly, if that was acceptable. Elsie said that she didn't mind, and sat down. Miss Marple said, without preliminary, that she was not connected to Ashcombe House in any official capacity, that she had no authority of any kind, and that nothing Elsie said to her would go any further than her own understanding unless Elsie herself chose otherwise. She said this with the particular quietness that carries more reassurance than any amount of formal assurance, and she saw in the slight easing of Elsie's shoulders that it had been received as intended. Then she said that she had been following the circumstances of Elsie's departure from Ashcombe House with some attention, and that she wished, if Elsie was willing, to tell her what she understood to have occurred, and to invite Elsie to correct her where she was wrong. Elsie said, with a directness that Miss Marple found immediately likeable, that she could try. Miss Marple said that she understood Elsie to have observed, during the weeks before her departure, an intimacy between Mr. Stephen Carrington and Mrs. Penelope Ward that had taken place within Ashcombe House, conducted with some discretion, but not with sufficient discretion to escape the notice of a conscientious member of the household staff who moved through its rooms and passages in the ordinary course of her duties. Elsie was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. That was about the size of it. Miss Marple asked whether she would be willing to say what she had specifically observed, not for any purpose of exposure or accusation, but because a clear account would help her to understand whether Mrs. Carrington had in Elsie's view, been aware of the situation herself? Elsie thought about this carefully, in a way that suggested she had thought about it a good many times already. She said that she had not seen anything she could call openly wrong. She wanted to be clear about that. She had not witnessed anything that could be stated in plain terms without the kind of interpretation that might have been incorrect. But she had seen, on 3 or 4 occasions, small things that taken together produced an impression she could not dismiss. Mr. Carrington coming down the back staircase at an hour when there was no reasonable errand to bring him there. Mrs. Ward leaving the house one afternoon by the side gate rather than the front path. On one occasion, a door closed with a quietness that suggested it had been closed with the intention that it should not be heard. On another, a brief exchange in the upstairs corridor, not the exchange of 2 people conducting an ordinary social visit, but something shorter and lower, and with the particular quality of 2 people negotiating rather than conversing. None of these things, individually amounted to a statement, but they accumulated, as small things do, into a weight that a young woman of conscience could not entirely set aside. Miss Marple said that she understood perfectly, and asked whether Elsie had formed any view about Mrs. Carrington's awareness. Elsie said that this had been the question that troubled her most. At first she had thought Mrs. Carrington did not know. The household was large enough, and Mrs. Carrington's attention was occupied with a sufficient number of things that it seemed possible the situation had been managed entirely in her blind spots. But then, about a week before she left, something had occurred that had altered that impression. She had been bringing tea to Mrs. Carrington's sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon, and had arrived at the door to find it not quite properly latched. Through the gap she had heard Mrs. Carrington speaking on the telephone. She had not intended to listen, and she would not ordinarily have done so, but she had heard her own name. Or at least she had heard the word girl spoken in a certain tone, followed by a sentence she had not caught clearly, but which had contained, she was fairly certain, the words cannot be allowed to continue in this way. She had set the tray down outside the door and retreated without knocking, and had thought about what she had heard for the remainder of the day and through most of the following night. Miss Marple asked, very gently, what conclusion she had drawn. Elsie said that she had concluded that Mrs. Carrington knew rather more than she had been showing, and that the question of what to do about it, about both the situation itself and about the presence of a maid who had noticed it, had already been under consideration before Elsie had written her note, or folded her uniform, or made any decision of her own. In other words, she said, with the composed sadness of someone who has arrived at an unpleasant truth without bitterness, she had not left before she was pushed by very much. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. Then she said, with a warmth that was entirely sincere, that she thought Elsie had handled an extremely difficult situation, with a degree of judgment and restraint that many older and more experienced people would have found beyond them. She said that the note had been wisely worded, careful in exactly the right ways, and that the manner of her departure had spoken well of her character. Elsie said that she had not been sure at the time whether it was wisdom or simply not knowing what else to do. Miss Marple said that in her experience those 2 things were rather more often the same thing than people generally supposed. She stayed for perhaps 20 minutes in total, and when she rose to leave she told Elsie that she thought she had found herself a quiet and decent household, and that she hoped she would be comfortable there. Elsie said thank you, and showed her to the door with the same careful composure with which she had received her. Miss Marple walked back across the Witchford Green in the warm Monday afternoon light, as past the church with its old yew tree and the post office with its cheerful window box, and got back into Dolly Bantry's motor car. Dolly looked up from her novel and asked how it had gone. Miss Marple said it had gone very well. She had heard what she had expected to hear, and 1 or 2 things she had not expected, and the picture was now complete enough that she could describe it accurately. Dolly asked what the picture was. Miss Marple looked out at the Witchford Green, where 2 small boys were doing something inadvisable with a bicycle and a plank. She said that she would explain it properly to Dolly, but that she would prefer to do so over tea in a comfortable chair, at a moment when neither of them was going anywhere. Dolly said that she thought this was entirely reasonable and started the motor. The road back to St Mary Mead was golden and quiet in the afternoon light, and Miss Marple, who had found what she had come for, sat beside her old friend, in a silence that was not the silence of concealment, but the silence of a person who has understood something fully at last, and is simply allowing herself for a little while to hold it steadily before putting it into words. The girl had chosen her words with care. Miss Marple thought she could do the same. Chapter 10. Miss Marple watches the garden path. The tea that Miss Marple had promised Dolly was taken the following afternoon, in the sitting room at Miss Marple's cottage, where the light came in at a pleasant angle through the west-facing window, and the garden beyond it was at its best. The roses fully open, the sweet williams in strong colour along the border, and the clematis on the south wall, so comprehensively in flower that it had begun to make aesthetic claims on the territory it had previously only occupied. Dolly arrived at 3:30 with the appetite of someone who has been exercising patience for longer than is comfortable, and who deserves, on those grounds, both a good explanation and a slice of something substantial. Miss Marple had made a seed cake, which she considered appropriate to the occasion. She poured the tea, cut the cake, and explained the matter with the clarity and economy of a person who has had sufficient time to arrange her thoughts and sees no reason to withhold them. Elsie Turner had observed, over the course of several weeks, a private intimacy between Mr. Stephen Carrington and Mrs. Penelope Ward, conducted within the walls of Ashcombe House, with what its participants had considered adequate discretion, but which had not been adequate enough to escape the notice of a young woman moving quietly through its passages in the performance of her ordinary duties. The intimacy was not, in the technical sense, openly scandalous. There had been no single dramatic incident, no undeniable scene. There had been instead the accumulation of small evidences, a door closed and a staircase used at the wrong hour, a departure by the side gate, a conversation that carried the particular compressed urgency of two people managing something rather than discussing it, that together described a situation whose character was not in serious doubt. Mrs. Ward had been staying at Ashcombe House, using the spare bedroom for a period of several days. The hat box and the dressing case confirmed an extended stay. The brooch left on the washstand was the small, telling carelessness of a departure made in haste when the arrangements of the previous days had been disrupted by something, the note, most probably, or the knowledge that the note was coming, and she had left without attending to everything she would ordinarily have collected. Dolly asked whether Mrs. Carrington had known. Miss Marple said that this was the question that had required most care, and that the answer was, she believed, yes, though not perhaps from the beginning. She thought that Mrs. Carrington had begun by not knowing, or by knowing only the general outline without the specific detail, and that she had arrived at fuller knowledge gradually, in the way one sometimes arrives at an uncomfortable truth, not through a single revelation, but through the quiet accumulation of impressions that one has been, up to a point, successfully avoiding. The telephone conversation that Elsie had overheard suggested that by the week before the departure, Mrs. Carrington had reached the stage of active management. She was no longer avoiding the knowledge. She was deciding what to do with it. What she had decided was characteristic of her. She had not confronted her nephew, who was a guest in her house and a member of her late husband's family, and whose continued goodwill was presumably not without value to her. She had not addressed Mrs. Ward directly, for similar reasons, and because directness in such matters tends to produce the very exposure it seeks to avoid. She had instead identified the weakest point in the arrangement, the young woman who had noticed too much, and who could not, in the long run, be relied upon to remain silent, and had removed her with the quiet efficiency that distinguished all her household management. It was, Miss Marple said, a thoroughly rational decision. She did not say it was a kind one. Dolly said that it seemed very hard on the girl. Miss Marple said that it was, and that Elsie Turner, who had tried to navigate a situation she understood only partially with the tools available to a young woman of her position and experience, had done rather better than anyone had given her credit for. Her note had been addressed to no one, and had named nothing specifically, Because she had understood with the instinctive wisdom of someone who has been quietly observing how the world works, that specificity would be used against her. Her departure had been orderly and composed because she'd made her decision in advance and had seen no advantage in dramatizing it. She had not, in any of this, behaved foolishly. She had simply been in a position where wisdom and good behaviour were not sufficient protection. Dolly said that this was a disheartening conclusion. Miss Marple agreed that it was, in some respects. And yet, she said, Elsie had found a decent position in a quiet household, and she was settled and comfortable, and she had left Ashcombe House with her integrity undamaged, and her understanding of the world rather more complete than when she had arrived. There were worse outcomes for a young woman of 22, as for the others. Mr. Stephen Carrington had, within a fortnight of Elsie's departure, concluded whatever business had brought him to the area and taken himself elsewhere. His aunt had given no public indication of whether his departure was a relief or a loss, which suggested that it was probably both in roughly equal measure. He was, Miss Marple thought, a man who caused difficulties with the genuine innocence of someone who has never fully understood that other people's arrangements can be disturbed by his own preferences, and who would no doubt continue to do so in whatever house received him next. Mrs. Ward's visits to Ashcombe House had become less frequent. She still called. The friendship, if friendship was the right word for what existed between two women whose social worlds overlapped sufficiently to require continued cooperation, had not been openly dissolved. It had simply been adjusted. The hat-box and the dressing case had not reappeared. The spare bedroom presumably stood empty. And Mrs. Carrington continued as she had always continued, composed, well-ordered, attentive to the management of her household and her social obligations. Whether she was, beneath that composure, unhappy or relieved, or simply tired, Miss Marple could not say with certainty. She suspected the answer was all three. Yet Dolly refilled her own cup and said that she supposed justice hadn't really been done to anyone in the whole affair. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden. She said that she wasn't sure she would describe the situation in terms of justice. Exactly. It was more that each person had acted according to their own particular lights and capacities, and the results had been distributed in the unfair way that the results of such situations generally were, with the person who had behaved best receiving the fewest material rewards, and the persons who had behaved rather more selfishly continuing more or less as before. She paused. She said that this was not, in her experience, an unusual outcome, and that the appropriate response to it was not despair, which accomplished nothing, but a steady and realistic understanding of how people manage their affairs, an understanding that allowed one to see things clearly without expecting them to be other than they were. Dolly said that Miss Marple made it sound almost consoling. Miss Marple said that she did not intend it as consolation, precisely, only as accuracy. They finished the cake in a companionable silence, and then Dolly gathered her things and said her goodbyes, with the affectionate ease of old friendship, and went out through the garden gate and along the path toward her motor car, her footsteps light on the gravel. Miss Marple remained in her chair by the window, and watched the garden path for a little while after the sound of the motor had faded. The afternoon was warm and very still. The roses along the south wall were at their full and generous best. A wood pigeon had settled somewhere in the apple tree and was making its entirely self-satisfied observations to no one in particular. The light lay over the garden with the particular softness of a late June afternoon, which has about it a quality of fullness, as though the day has arrived at exactly what it intended and is in no hurry to become the evening. Miss Marple thought about a young woman standing on a dark staircase landing, listening, deciding. She thought about a folded uniform placed on a